Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many folks joining us from all across the country. My name is Kate Schwanhauser, and I am the events manager here at Food and Water Watch and the host of this monthly virtual event series that we call Livable Future Live. And for this month's topic, we will be talking about factory farm pollution, and specifically how taking legal action is a really powerful way to rein that in and create long-lasting change to monitor and hold polluters accountable. In a couple minutes, we're going to be joined by members of Food and Water Watch's legal team and a guest speaker who is a community advocate and a declarant in one of the cases that we've brought against regulatory agencies like the EPA. I do want to give people just another minute to keep getting logged in. So in the meantime, I just have a couple of reminders and announcements for other upcoming events you can join us for. So first, if you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, just click on the Show Captions button in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. You can also continue to use the chat box during the event as a space to share your thoughts and have a conversation with others who are here today. And we will be saving some time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions for our speakers as you're listening to today's discussion, please add those into the Q&A box and we'll get to those towards the end of our program. And finally, I am recording today's conversation, so we'll be sharing that, the link to that later this week. So before we get started, just a little bit of background on Food and Water Watch. So many of you know that we are a national organization fighting for sustainable food, clean water, and a livable climate for all of us. And one of the main ways that we do this is holding corporations accountable, whether that's the fossil fuel industry or industrial agriculture like factory farms and CAFOs, or just other economic interests that are disregarding our environment and the health of our planet and our communities. And many of you are also probably familiar with our grassroots organizing work to fight for policy change at the local, state, and federal level. But another really powerful tool at our disposal is using our legal system to hold corporations and regulatory agencies accountable. And that's what we're going to learn more about in just a few moments. And really, the work that we do here at Food and Water Watch is possible because of activists like you. We have big plans for this year. You can check out our top 10 priorities at the link that we'll put in the chat. And there are just a ton of ways that you can be a part of this. You can join us at more events. You can sign up to be part of our volunteer network. You can make a donation, lots of opportunities. And we'll put some ways for you to do that in the chat. And whichever you choose, thank you so much for engaging and taking actions on these issues and being here with us today. And speaking of upcoming events, this is just a little preview of what's coming up in the next few months. In March next month, we're hosting Food and Water Actions, which is our sister organization, is hosting an election launch party with some special guests to kick off what we know is a critical election year and talk about how you can help us get out the vote. The election may not be until November, but with so many primaries already underway, it's just really important that we hit the ground running now. And in April, you can join us during Earth Week for Planet versus Plastic to learn how we can tackle the plastic crisis at the source and ultimately break free from plastic pollution. All right, so let's go ahead and get to it. For too long, polluters, particularly factory farms, have gone unmonitored and unregulated, and it's our water and communities who have been suffering as a result. And Food and Water Watch has a legal arm with an all-star team of legal experts who we refer to as Food and Water Justice, and they are dedicated to breaking this cycle by challenging regulatory agencies in court to force them to update these critical pollution regulations. And these cases have a direct impact on air and water quality for communities across the country. And today we are going to hear from members of our Food and Water Justice team and an advocate who is a declarant in one of these cases. So let me start off with a round of introductions. Joining us today, we have Tara Heinzen, who is our legal director. And she's joining us from Portland, Oregon, and she has been with Food and Water Watch for over 8 years and has been working to hold factory farms accountable for over 2 decades. We also have Emily Miller, who is one of our staff attorneys joining us from Boulder, Colorado. She focuses her advocacy work on combating factory farm water and air pollution. We're also joined by Tyler Lobdell, who is another of our staff attorneys joining us from Boise, Idaho. And like Emily, he also focuses on fighting the many ways that factory farms harm our environment, health, and communities. And last but not least, please join me in welcoming Kemp Burdette. He is the Cape Fear River Keeper and has worked to protect water quality in the Cape Fear Basin in eastern North Carolina for 16 years. And Kemp is a declarant in one of the cases that we'll be discussing today. So thank you all so much for being here today. And let's get right to it. Tara, I will start off with you. If you could set the stage for our viewers and just share sort of what is the overarching mission of our Food and Water Justice legal program?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, and thanks everyone for being here. So yeah, as Kate explained, Food and Water Watch works primarily to build the grassroots power that we need to win bold policy solutions to really big, intractable challenges like factory farming and climate change. And we do this through organizing at the state and local level in combination with legal policy research and communication strategies. So as an organizing focused organization, our legal approach is a little bit unique. We know that litigation is a critical tool, and sometimes it's the best or the only tool, but we also know that we can't win all of our campaigns. We can't ban factory farms. We can't completely transition off of fossil fuels through the courts alone. And so that means that we use legal tools, including litigation, holistically, and we try to do that to advance our mission and our on-the-ground campaigns. We try not to litigate, in a vacuum. Instead, we think really broadly about how to get value from our lawsuits and also spend a lot of time incorporating a lot of different types of legal advocacy throughout our organizing work. So as a result, our small legal team does everything from commenting on permits to requesting public records to drafting legislation to some of the high impact litigation in federal courts that we'll talk about today. Most of our legal work does focus on advancing our campaign to ban factory farms. And that's in part because factory farming is one of the biggest sources of water pollution in the country. And at the same time, it's one of the least regulated industries. These operations confine hundreds, thousands, or even millions of animals and all of the waste that they produce. So not only is this system incredibly cruel, but the disposal of millions of gallons of this really dangerous waste by spraying it or dumping it on cropland leads to widespread runoff and contamination of rivers, streams, and groundwater. So today we're going to focus on several lawsuits that Food and Water Watch is leading to finally compel the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and state agencies to hold this industry accountable for its pollution.
Great, thank you for that overview, Tara. So I mentioned this at the beginning, but we know this is a really big year for a lot of reasons, and that's also true for our legal work and our legal team. We've got a lot of big cases in 2024, so I'm wondering if we could do a little bit of a round robin and share some of the big cases that are happening this year and some of the real world impacts that these will have on our communities. Tara, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'll just give kind of the big picture. We have a few cases in the pipeline that we've been really working to tee up over several years of advocacy, and this year is going to be very important to those cases, and I think the future of factory farm water pollution regulation nationally. And if I could just say a little bit about the Federal Clean Water Act, because I think it's important to our discussion today, but this law is one of our bedrock environmental laws in the United States. It established a system for regulating polluters by requiring permits that set limits on pollution discharges. And this permit program is the main key to the Clean Water Act's success in restoring so many of the country's waterways over the past 50 years. The act specifically calls out factory farms, which you might hear us refer to as CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. It specifically calls out this industry as an industry EPA has to regulate under this permit program. But most of these facilities remain completely unregulated because of EPA's weak, inadequate rules. And the factory farms that are regulated still benefit from weak permits that allow reckless practices like spreading waste on frozen ground and that don't require basic things like the pollution monitoring we need to hold polluters accountable. So as a lead up to one of the cases that Emily's going to talk about, in 2017, we sent EPA a really detailed legal petition for rulemaking, explaining the many ways that EPA's regulations have failed to protect water quality and laying out a roadmap for how EPA has to use its authority to better address this pollution. At a really high level, the petition demanded that EPA close loopholes that have allowed this industry to avoid regulation, and also that it make those permits that I talked about a lot stronger. So in the years since we've been able to successfully sue over some of the key issues in that petition, I will let Tyler and Emily talk about those.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Tara. So yeah, I'm going to speak about our monitoring litigation work. And as Tara discussed, the factory farm industry is largely unregulated. And one of the reasons for that is this major loophole in how the Clean Water Act applies to this industry. So Tara mentioned that monitoring has not been a feature of that regulatory environment. And historically, factory farms have not been required to actually monitor what pollution they add to our lakes, rivers, and streams and groundwater, just like as essentially every other industry is required to that's regulated under the Clean Water Act. That is until now. So in 2021, we won a case in federal court against the US EPA over its general permit for factory farms in the state of Idaho. And the federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with us and held that just as with all other industries, Clean Water Act permits for factory farms must require monitoring and reporting so that we can get a handle on how much pollution this industry is responsible for. So that opinion was groundbreaking. And some folks on this call might be a bit surprised to hear that this really common sense measure of monitoring isn't already a part of the status quo. It's so obvious that it's necessary. But it is groundbreaking because it allows us to break this logjam of circular logic that regulators in this industry have used to skirt meaningful oversight and regulation of their water pollution. So essentially the way regulators have often approached factory farms is that because factory farms claim that they don't pollute water, and because Clean Water Act permits for factory farms contain some pretty strict limits on what pollution is allowed and are sometimes incorrectly characterized as no discharge permits, that because of those two things, there's no need for really anyone to look to see whether either of those things are true in reality. In other words, whether factory farms are not polluting our waterways, and if they are, to what degree. In reality, we know that the complete opposite is the case. We know that factory farms routinely and frankly by design pollute water. It is built into the structure of the factory farm model. So establishing that EPA and states can't just assume that this isn't a problem is actually a really huge step in the right direction. And our work now has transitioned to implementing that groundbreaking decision in states throughout the country. So we're currently, Food and Water Watch is currently at different stages of challenging these same general permits in the states of Washington, Colorado, and Montana. And we're tracking several of the states, including Idaho, to ensure that this new accountability regime is implemented effectively on the ground. And the point here is a reform that will require factory farms to actually report real data about how much pollution they're putting into our lakes, rivers, streams, and groundwater, right? That will allow communities to more easily hold local polluters accountable, because the status quo doesn't provide the information one would expect to need to hold a polluter accountable. So it helps local advocates protect their local communities. It also is incredibly important for more systemic sort of reforms in the umbrella regulatory environment that this industry currently enjoys such lax oversight in, right? Because when real data is collected about this industry, it shows the same thing over and over and over. And that is that the status quo of regulation is ineffective and it's allowing very serious harms across the country. So with that, I'll pass it over to Emily to talk about some of those broader efforts for reform.
Thanks, Tyler. So I'm going to focus on two cases that we've brought. One focused on one of those big problems that Tara pointed out in the beginning, which is that the Clean Water Act permits that factory farms are actually subject to are ineffective. They have completely lax and outdated standards written into them that aren't effectively controlling the industry's pollution. So in 2021, we filed a lawsuit against EPA for its failure to update and strengthen these pollution standards. EPA is actually required by law to every single year take a look at these standards and strengthen them as necessary, as technologies evolve, as new and improved management practices come out that are better at controlling the industry's waste. EPA has, for the past 15 plus years, every year looked at the industry's pollution standards and just checked a box saying they are fine. And we know that is not true. EPA knows that's not true. The standards only apply to the largest factory farm operations. They don't even attempt to control a lot of the pollution, the pollutants in CAFO wastewater. So pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, pesticides. And they sanction a whole host of high-risk disposal and application practices that EPA knows leads to serious runoff problems. So when we sued the agency in 2021 over its bad and flawed review of these pollution standards, we successfully pressured EPA to reconsider. And what EPA said it would do in January of 2023 is launch a detailed study of factory farm water pollution so that it could get a better sense of the polluting impacts of the industry and what practices and technologies are out there in the past 15 years that would do a better job. And after this detailed study, EPA would then decide whether it is necessary to be updating these regulations. So this was a really important win for us. These detailed studies are often the first step the agency will take before it agrees to strengthen standards in the sector. And we are planning to keep on the agency as it embarks on this probably year or 2 year long process, make sure it's looking at the right information, that there is community engagement and involvement in this study process so that the EPA has no choice but to reach the conclusion that its standards are no good and they need to be strengthened, as we have known for many years. The next case that I'm focused on actually right now, actually we will be filing our main arguments in court next week. So I'm very much living and breathing this case right now, is focused on the 2017 petition for rulemaking that Tara mentioned at the top. And as Tara said, that was a very detailed roadmap that we provided EPA, essentially recommending how the agency could update and strengthen its regulations to ensure that factory farms are permitted under the Clean Water Act and that those permits are effective. It took EPA over 6 years to actually respond to this petition, something it has to do by law. And they only responded after we sued them to force that answer. But they did finally answer. They did so in August of 2023, and they denied the petition in full. They said that instead of making necessary regulatory updates, what they wanted to do was move forward with this detailed study process that they had already agreed to from our prior case that I just mentioned, and also launch a federal advisory committee process to further study the problem of factory farm pollution and come up with some recommendations, particularly focused on what the agency could do to enhance its existing program. So really just more delay tactics, kicking the can down the road on regulatory reform. So we sued the agency over their denial of our petition. And we're really focusing on the failure of the program to require CAFOs to have permits in the first place, which is a huge gaping loophole that EPA's regulations have created. EPA estimates that about 75% of factory farms discharge pollution to waterways, but at the same time, only 30% of factory farms have the required permit. So what that means is that under EPA's current regulatory program, nearly 10,000 factory farms across the country are illegally discharging pollution in violation of the Clean Water Act. EPA has allowed that untenable situation to continue for decades. And now faced with the chance to finally correct course and change their regulations, specifically closing some regulatory exemptions that have allowed the industry to evade Clean Water Act permits altogether, and EPA refuses to do so. So we're bringing them to court. And this is the case that Kemp is a declarant and his experience, both professionally and personally, with factory farm pollution and the lack of federal and state oversight really underscores for the court just how problematic EPA's failed CAFO program has been.
Thanks, Emily. Kemp, I'd like to turn it over to you now. I think Emily just described, how pervasive this complete lack of regulation is and just the scale of it, which is astounding. So I'm wondering if you can share for our audience, what does this lack of regulation mean on the ground where you are? How have you felt those impacts personally? And what has that been doing to your watershed and your community?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today. I think the biggest and the simplest way to describe what a lack of strong EPA regulation means in North Carolina is that it means that basically the swine and poultry industry via, the legislators that have, benefited from significant campaign contributions, that the industry is controlling how we regulate the industry in North Carolina. Only a handful of swine CAFOs in North Carolina have NPDES permits. More than 99% of them operate under a general permit that's administered by the state. And there's no permit required for the thousands of poultry CAFOs in North Carolina. And that number is growing every day as that industry explodes here because of the lack of permitting. In fact, in North Carolina, our Department of Agriculture continues to refuse to even share the location of poultry CAFOs with our Department of Environmental Quality. So that's the kind of stronghold that the industry has on permitting North Carolina. And depending on how you slice it, we're a big player. We're either number 2 or number 3 in swine production nationwide. A huge number of hogs are grown in North Carolina, about 10 million. And we're between 1 and 3 for poultry, for eggs, and for turkey production nationwide. So, those industries are extremely powerful. That sector of our economy is huge, and those industries have invested in legislators that are, helping them to evade strong regulation. There's a slide that kind of shows just the scope of CAFOs here. This is in Duplin County. Duplin and Sampson counties are kind of central in the state, eastern part of the state. This is 150 swine and poultry CAFOs, and what you can tell is a pretty small area. All of them are located near waterways. They frequently line waterways on both sides. And, in North Carolina, it's pretty common to ditch these fields around these factory farms, both swine and poultry. And that means that's just a really easy way for waste, both liquid waste from swine CAFOs, swine factory farms, and litter from poultry farms to make its way into waterways. I've made over 100 flights over my watershed over the last, decade or so. And it's extremely rare not to see multiple violations of waste management rules when I fly. I make referrals of these violations. They are sometimes followed up on by the state. They occasionally result in notices of violation, which seem to have really minimal impact on the CAFOs in the long run. And they're frequently ignored, citing a lack of resources to investigate. And so all of this runoff results in significant impacts to water quality, air quality, and human health on a regular and ongoing basis. So we've taken water samples from creeks near factory farms that show bacteria levels, as high as 600 times more than the level that the state has set as safe for human contact. We've seen litter piles, enormous litter piles, larger than several houses, stay uncovered in the fields for over 18 months with absolutely no oversight. And I've talked to neighbors who can't go outside when the hog farm next door to them is spraying because the air quality is so bad that it'll trigger asthma or emphysema, and they don't want to experience what many neighbors of swine CAFOs have experienced, which is aerosolized hog waste drifting across fence lines and landing on your skin. It's an unbelievably kind of disgusting day-to-day occurrence in Eastern North Carolina. And this is all, when things are kind of happening the way they're designed to happen. This is just everyday life around these facilities. When hurricanes hit, the whole system goes even more haywire. We know that climate change is making hurricanes, bigger and stronger. We know that they're holding more rain, they're moving more slowly, so that when they track over North Carolina, they drop more of that rain. In the last 25 years, the Cape Fear Basin has had 2 1,000-year floods. We've had 1 500-year flood, and we've had so many 100-year floods that it's too many to even name. And that's just in the last 25 years. And these storms flood rivers, which spread across the low topography in Eastern North Carolina. They inundate hog farms and poultry farms. They inundate lagoons, they breach lagoons, they flood barns. Animals die inside those barns and are left inside those barns. And all of this waste is picked up by floodwaters and washed through communities, schools and homes and businesses and healthcare centers and churches. And we certainly experienced this, our family certainly experienced this as well, both in Hurricane Matthew and in Hurricane Florence. We had 5 feet of floodwater in our home. And the stench of hog waste, which I'm very familiar with, was so strong that it was everything you could do not to vomit as you tried to clean out, the mess that was inside your house. So yeah, just kind of a taste of what it means here to not have good federal oversight.
Thank you so much, Kemp, for sharing that. And just absolutely horrible to hear the types of impacts it has on daily life, even outside of these extreme weather events. Food and water justice works on a range of issues, climate, food, and water, but a lot of our casework is focused on this type of factory farm regulation and pollution monitoring of factory farms. Tyler, can you tell us a little bit just about why we have specifically put such a strong effort and focus in this space?
Sure, that's a great question. So, the Clean Water Act really does provide one of the most direct tools and authorities that are on the books today to regulate factory farms of all the federal laws. So there's a lot of potential under the Clean Water Act to make the factory farm industry pay its true costs instead of putting that burden onto communities and the environment, right? So sometimes you'll hear that phrased as internalizing the cost of operation. Factory farms gets to externalize a huge burden and thereby, reap more profits while communities around them have to suffer the consequences. And so, although CAFOs have been, largely let off the hook to date for their water pollution, the Clean Water Act really is one of the strongest tools that we have to address the industry. And, important to note that unlike federal animal welfare laws, which expressly exclude animals used in agriculture, the Clean Water Act expressly defines the types of facilities that need to be regulated to include factory farms. It specifically lists them in the statute. So it's unambiguous that the Clean Water Act was passed in part to rein in the rise of factory farms in this country. And you know, at a higher level, I mean, you should just be clear. I mean, factory farms are terrible for the climate. They're terrible for food security and food safety. They're terrible for water quality and local air quality, right? So this one industry cuts across a lot of the priority areas for Food and Water Watch. And despite that, not a lot of environmental advocates really focus on this industry. It's difficult work. It's not an easy industry to oppose, which I think makes food and water justice all the more critical, right? Because we really are out there playing hardball against an industry just the way they do, in a way that very few other environmental advocates are doing. And that's what we need to break this status quo, the idea that the environmental community can just accept the status quo and ask for, you know, changes on the margin is not something that Food and Water Watch accepts. And so we push for the real reforms that we need. And that is, we're filling a critical space in that respect. And so, yeah, I just think it's really critical for organizations, especially Food and Water Watch, to be pushing for those systemic changes. And again, the Clean Water Act is an extremely effective way for us to be pursuing that goal.
Great, thank you, Tyler. Kemp, I'd like to come back to you for a moment. You know, as the Cape Fear River Keeper, you are doing a lot of on-the-ground advocacy and organizing to protect the watershed. So could you share, you know, what prompted you to decide to pursue a legal avenue to address the pollution your watershed is facing? And how have you seen litigation add value to the advocacy and organizing work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, really, all the kind of reasons I mentioned before, which are basically just industry capture of our legislature, and you know, our legislature then completely hamstrings our regulatory agency by, you know, doing things like cutting their budget by more than 50% over the last 10 years, by, you know, passing laws that shield the industry, that make transparency, you know, extremely difficult. You know, federal oversight seems to be the only thing that works, and I don't say that lightly. We've tried, you know, really everything else we can think of. We've taken hundreds and hundreds of water samples to show that, you know, waterways are impaired, that in hopes that our state agency would you know, see these results, see the evidence, and say, oh, we've got to do something, and that didn't work. And we've you know, petitioned you know, for minor improvements. We've commented hundreds and probably thousands of times, you know, as an organization, on general permits as they come out, and really none of that is making much of a dent in the problem. I think it's really going to be at the federal level where we're going to hope to see improvements. And that's especially important because in North Carolina, things are actually getting worse right now. Poultry is exploding because of that lack of regulation. So every time I fly, I see a new poultry factory farm under construction. And even the swine industry, which has been operating under a moratorium because of a series of environmental disasters in the late 90s, you know, the moratorium is kind of cold comfort. We already have more in the Cape Fear Basin than any other watershed on the planet. And now the industry is using biogas and this enormous greenwashing campaign that goes along with biogas to entrench swine farms in Eastern North Carolina, all the while, you know, while poultry farms are being built, you know, virtually right on top of them. So we're in a pretty desperate situation in Eastern North Carolina, and this seems to be kind of our only hope here is some kind of federal action.
I just want to add to what Kemp's describing here. It's a reality that's happening across the country. Really, federal action is a urgently needed backstop to failed state regulatory efforts. We have a declarant in our petition case who she's based in Oregon, which right now is experiencing an explosion of poultry factory farm development. And the state is trying to get away with not regulating that industry as it should by saying that these operations don't discharge. And in light of kind of the state's position there, the onus is placed on the community to really try to fight these factory farms one by one in a sort of whack-a-mole way. And so having strong federal regulation that has uniform standards in place, make sure across the country the industry is regulated appropriately is really crucial, and a more kind of durable solution to this problem.
Great, thank you both. So yeah, I wanted to just ask, Tyler, you touched on this a little bit, but you were mentioning how it really is, food and water justice really is sort of a standout or standalone in this space for the way that we take legal action, which not a lot of other environmental organizations are doing. So I'm wondering if maybe Tara, you could talk a little bit more about, you know, the uniqueness of our approach and this area of our work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I already talked a little about how we integrate legal strategies into our organizing campaigns, which I think is pretty important. I think the other thing that sets our work apart is that we approach litigation kind of like we approach all of our work at Food and Water Watch. We are willing to fight for the bold solutions that we truly need, rather than working for incremental improvements based on, you know, this rigged system that exists currently. So for example, instead of working to play whack-a-mole and hold every individual factory farm accountable for unregulated water pollution under EPA's broken rules, we're trying to change the rules and make the whole system work better for everyone. We're also, as you've heard, like willing to play the long game with these really tough issues. So, you know, we set the stage for some of the cases we have now over 7 years ago with our rulemaking petition, and we've taken every opportunity since to challenge EPA's actions and failures to act on specific issues that we've identified years ago while we waited to sue them for an answer to that petition. We also think really broadly about how litigation can advance our overall work. And of course, winning in court is really critical, but there are other ways that these lawsuits advance Food and Water Watch's mission. So for example, litigation can really effectively shine a spotlight on the special treatment that agencies like EPA are giving to factory farms. It can help keep our issues in the news and advance our narrative about the need not only to regulate pollution, but ultimately to move away from this really destructive model of livestock production and fundamentally reform our food and farm system. And litigation can also help us lift up our grassroots allies and environmental justice communities that are disproportionately harmed by this industry's pollution. So we try really hard to work to build strong relationships with groups across the country and partner with a lot of allies that are directly impacted, people like Kemp, and work with them in the courts when it can advance our shared goals.
Great, thank you. And I know that a lot of people know that Food and Water Watch has, you know, organizers in states across the country who are working to push for policy reform that will tackle factory farms. I know, Kemp, you were doing the same in North Carolina. I'm wondering if you all could share some thoughts on how you see that work going hand in hand, the local organizing and these legal cases. You know, the organizing work can sometimes have a quicker timeline, a more immediate impact, and these legal cases can take many years. So how do you see those working hand in hand, and what value do these longer term fights have in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I mean, you know, policy change through organizing can happen more quickly, but honestly, in North Carolina, it's a real challenge. You know, we may get short-term wins, but we frequently see those wins kind of erased at the state level. So as an example, not necessarily as an organizing strategy, but there were some nuisance lawsuits filed here against Smithfield, and Smithfield started to really lose in courts. Juries of their peers were finding them guilty of impacting the quality of life for their neighbors, and so Smithfield's and the Port Council in North Carolina wrote legislation, which their supporters in the General Assembly were happy to pass, that basically made it impossible for any future nuisance lawsuits to be filed in the state of North Carolina. When the 2019 general permit was released, and it had some just minimal improvements on monitoring for phosphorus and other things. The Farm Bureau challenged that permit and eventually succeeded in having those provisions removed from the permit. When we worked to get community members to reach out to legislators that understood the kind of scope of the problem, those legislators would respond. Sometimes they'd introduce legislation like a poultry study bill that was introduced in 2019. This is just a study bill, had no regulatory teeth, had no oversight. It was just a bill that said, hey, we are quickly becoming number 1, 2, or 3 in the nation for poultry production. Maybe we should start to take a look at how this industry is impacting our environment and our public health, communities around the state. That bill never made it out of committee. There have been other bills introduced since then. They never make it out of committee. And so, really this kind of federal level action, although it may take longer and it certainly, is sometimes a slog through the courts, it seems to be something that when we, get victory here, that victory tends to be a more permanent positive change. Yeah.
And I can speak a little bit to an Oregon example, because I think there's some work going on here in Oregon that is a really good illustration of how legal work can help advance these policy and legislative goals. So Food and Water Watch is part of a great state-based coalition called Stand Up to Factory Farms, and we're working together to pass a factory farm moratorium in the state legislature. And the campaign has involved a lot of legal strategies for several years to, like I was saying before, keep these issues in the news, make it clear to policymakers that this is an important issue that they need to pay attention to. And those legal strategies have included things like petitions for emergency action to the Environmental Protection Agency, petitions to state agencies to adopt new regulatory requirements. And like I said, this has helped us keep the factory farm issue in the news for several years. And those legal strategies aren't over, they're ongoing, but it did play an important role already in our coalition actually successfully passing a bill last session that's going to strengthen pollution regulations and local control related to factory farms. And in response to passing that bill, SB 85, one county already used its new local control to establish mile-wide setback requirements between any new factory farms and residential properties. And that alone has already stopped 2 of the proposed chicken factories that Emily talked about, who are trying to move into the state. So the legal work, I think, has really helped advance our legislative campaign really effectively here.
Great, thank you. Yeah, overall, it sounds like there's just so much interplay between all of these methods that we have at our disposal, and it really is crucial and so valuable that we have all of these different tools that we're able to use to tackle this problem of factory farms and the pollution that's going unmonitored. I do want to save a little bit of time for questions from our audience. We've had a number come in so far while we've been having this discussion. And thank you to our team who've already put some answers in the chat for a few of those. And we'll take a couple minutes now to go through a couple of them live as well. So let's start with a question. Let's see. Love that you're taking on factory farm pollution, so important. Do you also do any work on plastic pollution?
Yes, we do. So the case that I described earlier, that's about the factory farm pollution standards written into permits. EPA's failure to update pollution standards is sort of widespread across many industries, not just factory farms. So we have joined a coalition lawsuit that is taking EPA to task for its failure to update these types of Clean Water Act standards for many different industries, including chemical fertilizer manufacturing and including plastics manufacturing. We know plastics pollution is a big problem, and we hope through this lawsuit, which similarly exposes the very flawed review that EPA does of these types of standards, will push the needle forward on improving regulation on that front.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from a community member who says that an anaerobic chicken manure plant is trying to come to her community, proposed right next to an elementary school. And she's asking, are there some resources where she and her community can learn more about how to stop it?
Yeah, I can take that one. Thanks for that question. And I think the first thing I would say is to that concerned citizen is that you're not alone, and that there are a lot of communities around the country right now that are in your shoes. This biogas or factory farm gas industry is very much on the rise, and so is concern about the impacts of that industry. And so one resource I would point you to is the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, a close ally of Food and Water Watch. They go by SRAP. And one of the amazing services that they provide is they can give some direct advice to community members who are faced with a particular project. So that's one resource that I would certainly encourage you to look up. Food and Water Watch has also published a lot about this factory farm gas industry. We opposed a large poultry industry waste project in Delaware, and so did a lot of analysis of the industry for that. And so, looking at Food and Water Watch's website and materials through Google searches, searching factory farm gas and the poultry industry, I'm confident you'll find those resources as well. But would love to hear if Kemp has more to add to that. This is an issue that is huge in North Carolina as well. North Carolina is one of the major hotspots for these kinds of developments. But I would say keep your head high. It's a fight worth having. You're not alone, and reach out for resources because there are people who have been in your shoes and have had to develop the strategies to push back.
Thank you, Tyler. Kemp, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Poultry digesters are a bit behind swine in North Carolina, so I'm not as familiar with that issue, but I kind of agree with what Tyler said, and working to organize your local community is important. I don't know what state this is in, but yeah, it really points to, for me, where we're going if we don't kind of get some kind of federal backstop. Each state is going to start to approach this thing differently, and the states with the weakest regulations are going to start to just be inundated with the industry who's kind of licking their chops at a state that's weak and unprepared for what's coming.
Thank you both. All right, our next question. How do you choose the states that you'll file cases in, and how does what happens in one state affect other states implementing or revising their regulations?
Yeah, I can start out with this one. If anyone has anything else to chime in, please do. But yeah, we try to be as strategic as we can in deciding where to file specific cases and where to advance certain arguments. But we also try to be opportunistic because we can't always choose exactly where and when to bring some of these things before a court. So for example, we very intentionally chose the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for the Idaho case that Tyler talked about pollution monitoring, because that was a rare opportunity to bring a permit challenge into federal court rather than state court. And that means that the precedent that we set is much more impactful. It's not a state court only opining on what needs to be done in that state. So now that we've set that federal Court of Appeals precedent, we're being really opportunistic about trying to use it and in every state where a permit is up for renewal, and that gives us the opportunity to bring a challenge. So those states so far have included Colorado, Montana, Washington, and we're keeping an eye out for other states. Of course, there might be terrible state courts that we want to avoid. We might not bring this everywhere. We will consider things like, what is the state's process? What allies do we have on the ground? What is the state's court makeup like? What federal circuit is the state in? Are there state law legal arguments that we want to incorporate into the case? So there are a lot of factors, but it is really a mix of thinking about where we can most strategically bring something and what opportunities, happen to come up.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more. This next one, does the Farm Bill do anything to address factory farms? Is that a piece of legislation that would sort of complement the work that your team is doing?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So, unfortunately, factory farms have actually been able to exploit some of the Farm Bill's conservation program funding for things like building manure cesspools, manure lagoons. So that's one of the main reasons, or one of the main places that we see the Farm Bill kind of intersecting with factory farms specifically. And one thing we'll be working for in the next Farm Bill is to remove these kind of perverse incentives and make sure the conservation funding allocated by the Farm Bill is going to truly environmentally friendly practices.
All right, and the next one that's come in is, how do you propose that laws regulating factory farm pollution be enforced? I think this is an interesting one because we've talked about how we need to push EPA to, put in place these stronger regulations, but then what does that next step, that enforcement, actually look like?
Yeah, I can start off with that one. I think that is a really good question. But I think the answer ties back to the regulations themselves. So having in place a baseline regulation that will give the agency the information it needs to better enforce the law. So for instance, having better monitoring requirements for factory farms, like Tyler was talking about, will help the EPA and state agencies ensure that those factory farms are complying with their permits, having stronger annual reporting requirements. So requiring the factory farm to give regulators more information about the manure that they're generating, their disposal practices, making sure that those disposal practices are in line with state and federal law, will again help those regulators enforce the laws and the regulations on the books. So it's really about designing the regulatory program in a comprehensive way to help ensure that they can and will be enforced down the line.
Great, thank you. We'll take one more and then I'll see if anyone has any final closing thoughts they'd like to leave us with. So the last one is, what are your thoughts on the case at the Supreme Court today, the challenge to EPA's good neighbor rule? Does someone want to take that?
Sure. This isn't a case that Food and Water Watch is involved with at all, but just at a high level, it's a case states are challenging a federal EPA Clean Air Act rule meant to hold upstream states accountable for harmful air pollution that they are producing that then blows downwind, making it hard for those kind of downwind receiving states to meet their own air pollution standards and protect public health within their borders. And so the issue at the Supreme Court today is basically that the court jumped in really prematurely in this case to consider an industry and state demand to pause the rules implementation nationwide while the litigation in the lower courts plays out. So there are a bunch of different cases at the lower courts, and the Supreme Court took up what it's basically considering to be an emergency review. And this is very procedurally rare. So I think, what I'm taking away from the fact that this is even happening is that it's concerning that the Supreme Court is willing to, invoke this kind of emergency provision to go after yet another EPA rule and not let it play out in the lower courts as it should. But on the merits of the rule, the substance of the rule, there's quite a ways to go before we're going to ultimately know whether it will be upheld.
Thank you. All right, we are coming up on our time here, so we'll wrap up the Q&A, but I want to thank everyone for sending in all of those great questions and for participating in this discussion. Before we let our speakers go, just wanted to see if anybody had any final closing thoughts they'd like to share before we wrap up.
I mean, I'm happy to just sort of follow on what Tara just said. This is very briefly, things have been a little bleak at the Supreme Court recently, as some may know, in terms of environmental regulation. But I think that really underscores what we've been trying to hammer today, and that is that existing law really applies to and should be regulating this industry. This isn't the type of situation where we need to write new laws or totally revamp the statutes that we have or do something really aggressive under them. It's just that this industry has gotten such a free pass under really clear authority. And so concerns about EPA's authority overall in other contexts are super valid. And I think in this context, as we are on very solid ground, that regulations need to be better and that the law not only allows for that, but demands it.
Thank you, Tyler. I think that's a great note to end on. All right, I do just have a couple of quick closing reminders before I let everyone go for the afternoon. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, as we've heard over the past hour, these are really long-term fights, and this change doesn't happen overnight. But the change that we're working toward will have direct and really long-lasting impacts on communities across the country. And as you've heard from our team, they are committed to keeping the pressure on through legal channels. And at the same time, our Food and Water Watch organizers will continue their on-the-ground efforts to pass policies like the one you heard about in Oregon. And we'll continue to partner with our amazing community advocates like Kemp and others across the country. If you would like to increase the impact that we can have, please consider becoming a Food and Water Watch member. You can make a one-time gift or sign up as a partner to make monthly donations, and that really does help us sustain these long-term fights. And I do hope that you'll join us again in the next month for our upcoming Livable Future live events. As I mentioned at the beginning, our event next month will be hosted by Food and Water Action, and we'll be talking about our plans to get out the vote in this critical election year. And then in April, we'll be talking more about how we are working to tackle the plastic crisis. And that's all for today. But as I mentioned, we did record today's conversation. So keep an eye on your inbox tomorrow. We'll be sending out a link where you can watch this recording, where you can share that with others. And we'll also include some of the resources that were discussed and shared in the chat today. In about an hour or so, you'll get an email or text notification asking you to share some feedback about today's event. Please go ahead and leave a comment for us. We find that to be really helpful. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us, and huge thank you to our legal team and to Kemp for your time today. We really appreciate getting to learn from you all, and thank you for all that you're doing on the ground, Kemp. So thanks, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. See you next time.